Once again, year 10. It's Mrs. Murray here, and I've got another poem for you. Another one from the anthology, which, as you know, we are looking at them individually at the present moment for exam purposes. You'll have one named poem in the exam, you'll have one copy of a poem in front of you on the exam paper, and then the other will need to come from your judgment, the one that you think will be the absolute best one that goes with it. So today we're going to look at a poem called The Prelude, and it's written by William Wordsworth. So before we start looking at the poem in detail, let's do a bit of a do now to get those brains working once again and having a little bit of a recap of things that you've done previously. So your first one, what is the soldier suffering from in Remains? Number 2, what's the soldier's biggest enemy in Exposure? Number 3, what is an emigrant? Number 4, what is a metaphor? And number 5, what's the technique called when you say a word more than once? Give yourself about 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll go through that together on the next slide. Okay, guys, here are the answers to the do now questions. So the soldier in Remains is suffering from something called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD for short. If you remember when we looked at the poem, it's when somebody is suffering symptoms when they've been through something really traumatic, a horrible experience, and the experience doesn't leave that person and scars them for life. The soldier's biggest enemy in Exposure is nature, the weather, which is not what we expect in that poem. We imagine it's going to be the enemy is going to be the German soldiers, but in fact, in that particular poem and in that war at that moment, it was nature that was far more dangerous. Emigrants are people who've left the country of their birth to settle elsewhere in the world. So the speaker in the poem Emigre was an emigrant. A metaphor is when you compare something to something else by saying it is that thing. It's a strong comparison, isn't it? So an example of that would be Juliet is the sun. And when you use a word more than once, the technique is simply called repetition. Repetition is a really good way of emphasising it, something, isn't it, a word? So we've done the do now, and this session that we're going to do now is going to be all about the Prelude by William Wordsworth. Some of the activities will require you to make notes in the booklet or on a different piece of paper. When you begin to annotate the poem, you can do this in your copies of the anthology if you wish. I want to just reassure you, though, that we will go through these poems again in class when you return to school. So we'll go through any misconceptions you might have made. And anything that you don't understand. If when I've looked at this, there's something that you're really troubled about, something that you really don't understand, you can email your teacher, who'll get back to you as soon as they can. But of course, there's an awful lot of students who are studying exactly the same poems as you are. If you go on to BBC Bitesize, you'll find information about all of these poems. The best place to look for more information is YouTube. YouTube really is your friend when it comes to revision. You've no doubt come across him already. There's a guy called Mr. Bruff who is a teacher, and he's got hundreds of videos on YouTube, and he goes through each of your anthology poems in great detail. But not just Mr. Bruff, there's loads of teachers out there. So if you are really worried about something, or you'd just like to get a better understanding of any of these poems, there's absolutely lots of information out there for you. But I do really want to reassure you that this is just your first glance at these poems. We will go back through them in detail. So before we read the poem, let's have a little think about the word prelude and start to make a few predictions. Any idea what the word prelude means? Is it a word you've come across before? The poem is about growing up, and you'll see when I read it what I mean by that. So as part of the Power and Conflict anthology, what messages about growing up do you think are going to be presented? So have a little think about that before you move on to the next slide. You might not have heard the word prelude before, and that is how you pronounce it, prelude. but you've definitely come across the prefix pre before, haven't you? It's in prefix, isn't it? Have a little think what that means, and it might help you to make sense of the word. So the word prelude means an action or event serving as an introduction to something more important. So you might be thinking, why did he call the poem The Prelude? Well, you're about to find out. Before we look at the poem in detail, I'm going to ask you to have a little think about some information about the poet himself. We're going to spend no more than 5 minutes on this. The Prelude is by this poet called William Wordsworth that I mentioned. I'm going to go through this contextual information below, and then what I'd like you to do is to reduce the information just into 4 bullet points to help you understand what influenced Wordsworth's writing. As you've probably gathered, everything that we do in English literature, it's really important that you understand the times in which the poet or the playwright or the novelist were writing in, because it has a massive impact on the way that they write, but also our understanding of the poem or the play or the novel. So let me tell you about William Wordsworth. As you can see, he was born in 1770. He died in 1850. This is an awful long time ago. So this is one of the oldest poems in the anthology. He is one of the most famous poets in the history of English literature. He was born in a beautiful place called the Lake District, which you've probably heard of. And his birthplace had a huge influence on his writing. Wordsworth was one of the first writers whose work was labelled as what we call romantic. Much of his poetry is about humanity's relationship with nature. Now, it might be worth looking at some pictures perhaps of the Lake District. It is one of the most beautiful places in England. It's absolutely dominated by nature. It has these beautiful, vast lakes and mountains, and it still looks very similar today to the Lake District Williams Wordsworth actually lived in. So the point is that he was surrounded by beautiful nature, and it had a massive impact on him. Romantic poets helped change the way people thought about the natural world. He believed mankind does not control nature, but the other way round. The Prelude discusses these ideas, but also explores the way identity is shaped by experience. William Blake, who wrote London, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, who wrote Ozymandias, were also part of the Romantic movement. All poems have a link to the power of humanity and how the natural world can affect it. Now, it's very odd, isn't it, that this idea, this word, the Romantics, in a modern sense, we presume that romantics are people who, it's all about love, isn't it? That's romance or romanticism. However, these 3 poets that we've studied and the movement that they were part of, the Romantic movement, has got nothing to do with romantic love. It's all about the power of nature and the control that nature has over our lives, and as human beings, our relationship with nature. So this poem isn't like some of the others, the other 2 poems that I did with you. We did Remains, didn't we? And we did Exposure. And there was no doubt that that was about war, wasn't it? This is different. Remember that the anthology is called Power and Conflict, but it doesn't necessarily mean war. So in the poem, we'll see that there's some conflict, but it's very much about power. And power, not war in this instance, but the power of nature. Read the poem out loud to you. The Prelude by William Wordsworth. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point. With an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan, when from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the cover to the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. So what on earth is all that about then? It probably seems like quite a difficult poem at first, but I promise you when we go through it, you'll actually see that it's quite straightforward. The Prelude itself, the big poem, is an autobiographic epic poem in 14 sections. It's said to be one of the greatest works of English literature. Now, by an autobiographic poem, it means that the poem is all about the poet's life. The first version was written in 1798, but Wordsworth continued to refine it throughout his life. It was published 3 months after his death in 1850. So look, he was working on that poem for 52 years. I recently did a little bit of research, and the difference between the poem when he first wrote it and when he published it is incredible. He did so many revisions and so much changing of it. It's called an epic poem, and epics are usually about heroic deeds and events, but the Prelude portrays an internal journey. In this extract, because the bit that I've just read you, the bit that we study, is only a little tiny extract from a much, much longer poem. In this extract, it's the story of Wordsworth's spiritual growth and how he comes to terms with his place in nature and the world. He explores memories of important events in his life and his travels. And he described the Prelude as a poem on the growth of my own mind, with contrasting views of man, nature, and society. So, what happens in this poem then? Okay, hopefully, you realise that at the very start of the poem, he's out and he's outside at night, he's out in the countryside, and he sees a boat and he steals the boat. He steals the boat and he takes it onto the lake and he rows it along. And at the start of the poem, he's feeling pretty pleased with himself. He's kind of like, yeah, I'm a really good oarsman, I'm good at rowing, and he's enjoying it. Then he looks up and he sees this huge mountain. And this mountain intimidates him. He suddenly becomes aware of what he's done. He's fully aware that to have stolen was wrong. It wasn't the right thing to do. So what's happening here is it's his own guilt, isn't it? Because he feels ashamed and knows that what he's done is wrong. And in his imagination, the mountain, huge he described it as, suddenly gets up, if you like, and comes towards him, almost as if the mountain is chasing him and certainly as if it's telling him off. And then towards the end of the poem, he takes the boat back and puts it back where it should have been, where it belongs. But he tells us at the end of the poem that this incident has stayed with him for the rest of his life. So you can see it's all about growing up. It's all about learning that there are things that we do that perhaps we shouldn't have done and how we deal with these things. But not only is it just about himself and growing up, it's also about the power of nature, isn't it? You will have just studied Ozymandias, and you know that that's about the power of nature, isn't it, as well? So this is a poem that goes with Ozymandias really, really well, really nicely. So I've just done a little bit of summarising there. See if you can just jot down a couple of bullet points about what you think is going on in that poem and why it's a journey of growing up. And then what I'm going to do then is go through the poem kind of line by line with you, and then all will become a little bit clearer. I've put here a link for you. It's a BBC clip, and it's all about the hip hop star Akala, who goes and visits the Lake District to discuss with poet Helen Mort how the dramatic landscape inspired parts of Wordsworth's poem, The Prelude. And they examine the boat stealing episode in detail. It's not a long little film. It's really, really worth watching though, because it will help you to understand the poem. And it's also all sort of filmed in the Lake District. So it'll help you to understand where Wordsworth lived and help us to understand why nature had such an effect on his life, why he felt it to be so powerful. But it really does help you if you know what the Lake District looks like. So I think it's about 8 minutes long, something like that. So when you finish looking at the PowerPoint, have a little click on this link and have a look at it, because you'll really find it helpful, and it's a really nice, easy video to watch. So you're going to spend, no, certainly no longer than 30 minutes on this activity. You're going to annotate the copy of the poem in the booklet or in your poetry anthology if you've got it. And once again, I've said we're going to go through this in class, so don't panic. Look at the line number. I'm going to go through it, and you can highlight or annotate or underline or circle anything that's useful to you. And I'm going to go through it, and like I say, I do not expect you to be absolute experts at the end of this, but I'm hoping that by the end of this you'll have a pretty good idea of what the poem's all about and how the poet felt. Let's have a look at the start of the poem. One summer evening, led by her. Led by her? Led by who? Right, it's personification that's happening there. Nature, who is referred to as female, led by her. So it's like nature took him there in the first place. The second line, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. The description of the setting here is, it's all very lovely, isn't it? There's nothing to worry about at this point. Little boat's there in her usual place, he says to us as well. In its I do apologise, in its usual place. He knew where the boat was, didn't he? Was he going there specifically for the purpose of taking it? Yes, I think he was. We see that in line 3, that he's clearly familiar with the setting, isn't he? And how does the narrator feel about taking the boat? So we have a look at line 4 and 5. I unloosed her chain and, stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Now, that's interest. Stealth, you probably know, is when you do something in a secretive way. But it's this phrase, isn't it? A troubled pleasure. That is an oxymoron, isn't it? Because they're two opposite words put together. A pleasure shouldn't be troubled. Now, he was certainly pleased about stealing the boat, but he knew, didn't he, right at the start of the poem, it wasn't the right thing to do. He knew it was wrong because it was a troubled pleasure. On line 8, we have this technique called assonance, leaving behind her still on either side. Assonance is when we have a repeated vowel sound, which we've got going on there. And then when we get into line 8 and 9, we have sibilance. Sibilance, if you remember, is when you repeat the S sound. So it's alliteration, but it's specific to the letter S, sibilance. And we've got that, leaving behind her still on either side, small circles. It's all very peaceful and lovely, isn't it, at this point? very calm because nothing untoward has happened yet. So the sibilance adds to the kind of like the calm and beautiful nature of these lines. Small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. Lines 9 to 11. How is nature presented here? Beautiful. All into one track of sparkling light. It sounds magical. Is the poet scared of nature at this point? Absolutely not. He's kind of overwhelmed, isn't he, by the beauty of nature. Listen to this now, lines 11 to 13. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fix my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. Right, now, this is where we get a bit of arrogance. He says, like one who rose, proud of his skill. He's pleased with himself at this point because he's a good rower. This is someone who lived all their life in the Lake District, which obviously has lots of lakes in it. So something he would have done as a young man would have been to have rowed a boat on the lakes, and clearly he was good at it. Is he troubled at this point? No, he's proud. He's really pleased with himself, isn't he? I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. There was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. Okay, lines 15 and 16. He focuses on nature's emptiness here. Why does he do that? Because there's nothing to worry about at this point, is there? There was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. Certainly no scary mountain at this point. All is good, all is calm. Okay, now have a look at this line. She was an elfin pinnace. Pinnace is just another word for a boat, but elfin. Now, this word elfin makes the atmosphere and the tone sound magical or otherworldly, doesn't it? Why do you think Wordsworth's doing this? Because it's all very magical and beautiful, isn't it, at this point? Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake. He means that he's rowing with all of his might. He's strong and proud as he's rowing along. And as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. Now, what technique have we got there? We've got a simile, haven't we? Okay. And the simile is comparing the boat going through the water like a swan. Now, we know that any image of a swan is one that has been chosen specifically to show how incredibly beautiful something is. So silently, and you think about how a swan glides through the water barely moves in front of it. It's a thing of beauty, isn't it? And then we have something called a volta at this point. It starts with the when from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound. Now, the volta, what that means is that the tone in the poem changes and things become different. And it's that point there, isn't it, after the swan bit, when behind that craggy steep, and then he sees the mountain. Now, the reason it's changed, everything was calm and lovely and beautiful, and he's really pleased with himself and he's a good rower. Then he sees the mountain. Okay. And we also have this line here. Till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. Okay, now we have a caesura in the middle of that sentence. A caesura, if you remember, is purely and simply when we have a break in the middle of a line of poetry, and it's indicated by a piece of punctuation that upreared its head, full stop, caesura. And have a look at how the mountain, a huge peak, black and huge. What technique have we got there? Well, it's very simple. It's repetition, isn't it? And why does he repeat the word huge? Because it's massive. And I also think this is William Wordsworth, one of the greatest living poets of all time. And he says the word huge twice. Now, he could probably think of 20 words that he could have used instead of huge. But He uses that word deliberately. It's almost like he's completely flustered at this point. He's not sure how to describe this. It's had such a massive effect on him, he can't even describe it properly. This is where nature gets very different, doesn't it? As if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for it seemed, with purpose of its own, a measured motion like a living thing strode after me. Okay, now this is all very different, isn't it? So we have here where, yes, it was all beautiful, but then suddenly there it is, big and huge, and it looks as if it lifts up its head. I struck and struck again. So he's striking with his oars into the water because he's scared, isn't he? He's now rowing very quickly and growing still in stature, the grim shape. Look at the language that's been used there, the grim shape. He's frightened now, isn't he? Growing still in stature means it's getting bigger. It towered up between me and the stars, so it's so enormous it's blocking off the sky. And still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, a measured motion like a living thing strode after me. He actually imagines that the mountain has got up and has walked behind him, is coming after him. It's his guilty conscience, isn't it, that's actually at play here. This is what's happening. Now look, we've got the use of sibilance once again, but it's not lovely and peaceful like it was at the start of the poem. The grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed. Now it strode after me. All that sounds, the sibilance. This is scary. This sounds sinister and not very nice. This is a frightened poet now. He says, with trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. Trembling oars. Why are the oars trembling? Well, you tremble when you're scared, don't you? And he goes back through the silent water, back to the cover of the willow tree. Where has he gone back to? He says, there, in the mooring place, I left my bark. A bark is another word for a boat. It's not an elfin pinnace now. It's not something beautiful and magical, is it? It's now a boat, isn't it? And through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. Now, the word grave is an ambiguous one. It literally means serious, like he says, in grave and serious mood. But the word grave obviously also has connotations of death, doesn't it? What is the poet telling us here? Why was he in a grave mood? He's been frightened, hasn't he? This is what's happened to him here. But serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense. That spectacle, something that he's been made to see, something that has absolutely shocked and horrified him. The end of the poem, he says, that spectacle for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. He's struggling to understand what he's seen. It's not every day that you think a massive mountain has got up and strode after you. And clearly, you know, this made him hugely aware of what he'd done. The stealing of the boat was a bad thing to do, and he really shouldn't have done it, should he? Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. It's had a massive effect on him. This hasn't just affected him at that moment, it stayed with him. He says, no familiar shapes remain, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields. Lovely nature, beautiful nature seems to have gone. It's disappeared at this point, hasn't it? But huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. Nature isn't cute and fluffy now, is it? Nature is scary and frightening and menacing. And he tells us It's not even just, it's during the day he thinks about this, but it has the biggest effect on him at night. So you can see why we talk about this poem being one about growing up, can't we? It was a very immature and perhaps a young man's type of thing to do, to go and steal the boat in the first place. But now he's a very different person afterwards, when he feels that he's done something that was very wrong, and it's nature that has well and truly told him off for what he did. So your last task, this is where you're going to do a little bit of writing about the poem. I've got a question here. It says, how does William Wordsworth present nature as being intimidating in extract from the Prelude? And I'd like you to have a go at writing a couple of paragraphs about that question. And that's exactly what the poem's about, isn't it? It's about nature being intimidating, about nature scaring him. So don't forget to include a clear point at the beginning of your first paragraph, which answers the question. You use quotations and single word analysis, that's zooming in on individual words. Try and explain why Wordsworth has used a certain word or phrase and the impression that it gives. Points about authorial intent. Now, what that phrase means, authorial intent. When we're analysing language, we've got to remember that people don't just by accident call a boat an elfin pinnace. That is Wordsworth very specifically trying to create an impression, to make the boat sound magical, to make the environment sound magical, nature sound magical. He chooses, remember how many times I said he rewrote the poem very, very carefully. So when we talk about authorial intent, it's about you understanding that the writer, the poet, has used a word very specifically to have a certain effect. What do you think Wordsworth is teaching or warning or revealing, or the importance of his criticising or celebrating? Is he warning us about nature? I think perhaps he is, isn't he? Are you stuck? Right, here's a nice paragraph to get you started. William Wordsworth presents nature as fear-inducing and intimidating as we follow the journey of the narrator. To begin with, the narrator feels calm and serene among nature. However, this soon changes when the huge peaks, black and huge, take charge over the summit. The adjective huge could suggest, okay, and that's where you start to do a little bit of language analysis. It's a long poem, it is, but when you go through it a couple of times, it actually becomes quite straightforward. I love it. It's a brilliant story, isn't it? All about a young man who behaves badly and frightens himself to death, isn't he? Or nature certainly scares him. All because he knew that what he was doing was wrong and he shouldn't have done it, and he shouldn't have stolen the boat in the first place. I hope that you've got a better understanding of that poem now. Don't forget what I said, there's loads and loads of help out there. And of course, we will be going through this poem again when we all get back to school together. I hope that's helped a little bit, and you go on and have a really good rest of the day, and see you all soon.